Welcome back, my friends, to the D-Rate the Hate podcast. I am your host, Wilk of WilksWorld.com, and I am so incredibly grateful that you are taking the time to join me for another powerful DTH episode. Friends, at the D-Rate the Hate podcast, it's all about bettering the world one attitude at a time. See, we did not create the hate, but with your help, we can derate the hate. That all starts with gratitude and personal accountability. We cannot control everything that happens to us in life, but we can control how we react to it. How we act, how we react, no matter what happens to us, how we react to it makes the difference. Friends, there is only one good thing about a bad attitude, and that is that we have the ability as individuals to change it. Here on the DTH podcast, we strive to bring you great guests and provide tools to do just that. Please be sure to share it with your friends. Subscribe if you haven't done so. Ratings and feedback are always greatly appreciated. And with that, let's get to this week's episode. Those of you who have been following the D-Rate the Hate podcast for any amount of time know about my passion for and my work with the group Braver Angels. You may also know about the Truth and Trust project that I've been involved with, involving my now good friend, Dr. Francis Collins, who I had on the podcast back in episodes 119 and 120. If you are not familiar with Dr. Francis Collins, he is the former head of the National Institutes of Health. He's worked for the last several presidents of the United States, currently works with the current president of the United States, and played a somewhat integral role in the government's response to this COVID-19 pandemic. The reason that's significant, my friends, is because you also may know that I have been an outspoken critic against the government's response to the pandemic. Now, in this day and age, some people would say, well, if you're an outspoken critic of the government's response to the pandemic, and Dr. Francis Collins was part of the government's response to the pandemic, how could you possibly be friends, be civil to each other? But it's because we have an incredible respect for each other as human beings. We have an incredible respect for each other and the beliefs that each of us hold. And just because there are some things that we don't agree on, some things that fall within our web of beliefs that are different, doesn't mean we cannot have a great conversation and learn more about each other, see the common humanity and the pillars that hold up those webs of belief. You see, my friends, both Dr. Francis Collins and I understand that if we are to get by as a country or even as a human race beyond COVID-19, we have to have the conversation. We have to look at each other. We have to find the common humanity, look at the pillars from which our webs of belief are built, and work through the tribalism that is now so prevalent. But that does not mean we have to continue to be ugly to each other. Please stay tuned for this great conversation. And more than that, be sure to share this conversation with your friends, especially those friends that you may not agree with, because you very likely became friends in the first place because their web of beliefs and your web of beliefs had a lot more similarities than they did differences. With that, here we go. Dr. Francis Collins, thank you for joining me again on the D-Rate the Hate podcast, my friend. It's been way too long. How are you?
I am okay, Wilk. It has been way too long, and we've been way too busy. I'm glad to jump back onto your podcast and see what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, we had in the midst of our Truth and Trust project with Braver Angels, we had a conversation. You and I did an exercise. I believe it was an exercise that you had come up with about a web of beliefs.
Yeah.
And that exercise I thought was incredible. And it really brought to light a few different things between us that I just wanted to talk about again today, for the podcast, because it's just been one of those exercises that I keep revisiting in my mind as something between us that just it did a lot more for our relationship, as friends. But the fact that we do differ so greatly on a number of things, related to the pandemic, and then maybe even related to other things, public policy wise. But it really showed us, you and I, that we have a lot of those core beliefs, the values that we live by, Francis, are a lot more aligned than we are apart. So I
Yep.
wanted to talk about that again today. So first, for the DTH listeners, why don't you talk about what that web of beliefs exercise was and how that came to be for you, and then you presented it to me.
Yeah. No, I'm glad to. It's a metaphor, but it's really helped me to understand how reasonable people, and I think you and I are both reasonable people, at least you are, I hope I am, can have very different views about something like public health recommendations. And yet somehow down underneath all of that, we have a great amount of shared values. And how do you interpret that? I'm just sort of getting used to the fact that as a scientist, it's not sufficient to simply say, well, here's the evidence, here are the facts, and then everybody will come up with the same conclusion, because that's not the way it works. David Hume, who's a famous philosopher who I never read when I was in college, but maybe I should have, said that reason is a slave of the passions. And that's certainly true for all of us, and including me, whether I want to admit it or not. And this is sort of how we all basically end up being filters a bit of the information that comes at us. And if I feel passionate about something and you try to convince me that I'm wrong about it, I'm going to have a hard time listening. Whereas if you're trying to convince me about something that I haven't paid that much attention to, it's not going to threaten me. I'm probably more likely to see your point of view and come around on it. So we're all like that. And the idea that we are rational actors simply isn't true. So I was kind of frustrated about this. And a friend of mine said, well, there's another philosopher that you might read who I'd never heard of. And he's got quite a name, Willard Van Orman Quine, Quine.
That is quite the name.
That's quite a handle. And basically, he came up with this metaphor, which I've now tried to take on board, which is that we all have a web of beliefs that we, whether we know it or not, utilize all the time to decide about incoming information and whether to give it credence or whether to deflect it. And that web is like a spider's web. So imagine that visual image. It's a circular, a very complicated, beautiful structure you might see in the early morning with dew on it. And in the center of the web, where the threads come together, are these really critical nodes. And if you were going to try to mess up the web, it would mess up pretty quickly if you went after those center nodes. On the outside, they're the threads that are less critical for its structure. And so those could be bumped into by something passing by and it wouldn't cause the web to come apart. That's, Quine said, what our beliefs are like. We have various things that we believe. The ones near the center, those are things we are really attached to. In my web of belief, the node in there that says my wife loves me. Yeah, that one's pretty darn central, and I know it is for you too, Wilk. And if somebody tries to tell me, well, no, actually, Diane doesn't love you, and here's the evidence for that, I'm going to have a quick response to that, which is, well, you better darn well have some serious evidence. You're talking about my wife. Whereas if somebody says, I have evidence that your cat doesn't really love you as much as you think she does, I'll go, yeah, okay, I could listen to that because I'm not that sure about my cat anyway. So
is anybody ever sure about what a cat thinks?
No, they like it that way.
Right.
So the cat's love is out there in one of those outer threads, whereas my wife's love is right there near the center. And so is my belief. I believe that Jesus died for me, literally, on the cross and was resurrected from the dead. That's part of who I am. That's a central part. And if somebody tries to say, well, no, we actually found these bones in a grave in somewhere in Israel and we think it's Jesus, I'm going to go, whoa, hang on a minute. He was raised from the dead. There should be no bones there. You better really prevent me with some evidence, and I probably won't believe you. So that's the concept. And of course, that then plays out in other ways. Well, like public health, which is what you and I have talked about quite a bit, because of course, it's been about COVID and what you and I have been both engaged in this national struggle to try to figure out what should we do with this worst pandemic in 100 years. And lots of mistakes got made, and a lot of people got pretty mad. In that regard, I would say pretty close, but not right at the center of my web, is the idea that vaccines are generally safe and effective and should be utilized to help prevent people from getting sick and dying from this. Whereas not everybody agrees with me on that. And there's certainly webs that some people have that say vaccines aren't safe and effective. Another one that would be pretty close to the center for me would be about climate change, that it's real and it's significant. And the evidence I see says that it's contributed to by human activity, and that we need to do something or we're on a track towards a very unpleasant outcome for our whole planet. So those are kinds of things. So that's the concept of the web. And what we'll come to in a minute, the idea that the web doesn't float freely in space. It has to be anchored to something. And that's where the encouraging news fits in, that it's anchored to these values. And your web and mine might be pretty different, but I think the pillars underneath there, and I think of them as pillars, and I even had my granddaughter, who's an artist, draw them as pillars. I think they, between you and me, are actually very much the same, even though our webs are different. So anyway, we had that conversation, and I asked you to take a web and put your own labels on it in terms of what's near the center and what's on the outside. And when we looked at yours and mine, they're different. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise, but they're different in kind of an informative way that I found helpful.
Yeah, and you know, when we look at those pillars and the pillars, which I would say are definitely our core values, and yeah, it was very informative. And then to see how the web comes together and the strength of what we believe, or the strength of our web of beliefs. I mean, we both have a similar web. We both have the same or very, very similar core values, but our webs are a bit different. Obviously, I am still in the same camp as you as a Christian. I do believe the resurrection is true. Post millennialism, God created all things, and is in control, ultimately in control of everything that happens with us. I think where it gets kind of wonky in the differences is when I think of God being in control, and I love this conversation, especially with somebody as versed as you, having written, the language of God and how science and Christianity make sense together. I look at my Christian faith and I say, God created this beautiful world of ours. Could we destroy it? Yes, I think we probably could. Would God allow it? No, I don't think he would. That's just me. I mean, that's so I put that one right in the middle, in the middle of my web, that says God is ultimately in control of all things. Not that man doesn't have free will, because man does. Obviously, that's part of the basis of Genesis. We have free will. That's what made us who we are. But I mean, when I look at the things that I've looked at when it comes to, let's say, climate change, and I certainly am not nearly as well versed as somebody who's studied science their whole life. But I look at science, or I look at the climate change, and I see the degradation of that whole concept when it comes to what politics has done to it. And when I look at, and that's one thing that I look at when making decisions on a lot of different things, Francis, is I see what politics has done to certain topics, certain things, and the people on one side of it are saying this, and the people on the other side of it are saying this, and I more closely align with a lot of the people that say, yeah, I think there is a certain amount of reality to climate change. But I also believe that the climate is always changing. I think there's been periods on this earth where it's been a lot warmer than it is now. There's been periods on this earth where it's been a lot colder than it is now. You know, was that due to man at the time? I don't believe that man's been on the planet for a million or a couple million years. I just don't, because I believe in the Christian or the biblical side of humankind. And I mean, I know cow flatulence wasn't, part of the reason that the ice or the glaciers in Minnesota, where I'm at, in South Dakota, North Dakota and stuff, there wasn't, buffalo farts weren't going to take out the glaciers. Cars weren't taking out the glaciers. So I don't know. My but the web of beliefs was such an awesome exercise, and it really brought to light a lot of the common things that we have and the differences that we have, but we both still have that web. We both still have those pillars holding up the outside, strands, the base of our web, right?
Yeah. It helped me actually to put my own arrows onto this web of where they belong, because it forced me to really ask, how important is that to you? For instance, one of the things we put a lot on our webs about public health was mandating masks in schools, an essential good idea at the worst of the pandemic. And I think probably during that time, I would have said yes, but now I'm not so sure. So that ended up being further out in the web by a lot, which is to say our webs are changing. They're not static. And of course,
Sure.
I can go back 45 years to when I was an atheist, and my web would have been totally different then.
Right.
Because right in the center of it would have been, there is no God. And now right in the center of it is, there is a God, and there is God's son who died for me. I mean, that would have been just outrageous for me 45 years ago.
Right. Well, I think you made such an incredible point there, is as we grow, and we need to keep on growing. If our mindset stays static, if we don't attempt to learn from our mistakes, that web will probably, if that web isn't changing with conditions and getting stronger and getting weaker and moving as, you look at a spider's web that goes in between two trees, as that tree grows, that web is going to have to change, right?
Yeah.
So
otherwise something's wrong.
otherwise it's gonna fall apart or whatever. So as we grow as human beings, our web of beliefs is going to have to change.
Yes.
And that goes for all sides. I mean, yeah, I mean, if I looked at what my web would have been, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would have been very, very different, very different than this web is now.
Yeah.
I mean, not just because I didn't have my wife in the picture at the time or whatever, but you even look at things such as my faith in God and in Christianity at this point. I grew up going to Sunday school, and we went to church occasionally, when my parents felt like it, and stuff. We were always raised as Christians, but we were not always a church going family. And with that being said, and I'll be completely honest, I don't go to church all the time now. Probably not as much as I should, but that doesn't affect my belief in Jesus Christ and the Bible and the stories of the Bible and everything else. But my faith 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was certainly not nearly what it is today. So I've had to grow as a person along with all the other things all the other ways that I've grown.
Yeah. But as our webs change, and they must, I think those pillars, those values change much less because they are kind of constants. And this is what's reassuring in our divisive time. They seem to be constant for most people. and the pillars that I put names on here, but you could argue about whether this is the right set, and I'm sure philosophers would. The pillars are freedom, faith, family, love, truth, beauty, and goodness. Those are my 7. Now, maybe justice should have been in there too. Maybe it needs to be 8. We could go on a bit about what's missing there. But that's not a bad set. Freedom, faith, family, love, truth, beauty, goodness. I don't know a whole lot of people will go like, well, those don't matter to me. Maybe the atheists will say the faith one, but they have their own faith in atheism. So it's basically, it's still there, whatever you call it. But the rest of these, I think, down through history, looking at every kind of human culture that we know something about, those values are pretty much there. They may attach to very different webs, but
the webs could look very different.
Yeah. That gives me hope that even now, when it feels like we've gotten so far apart from each other that we can't find our way back to some kind of understanding, well, Braver Angels is trying to change that, and you and I are doing our own small part to try to help with that. But it gives me hope that there's this foundation of who we are as humans, what we care about, these God-given sort of principles of what really matters, that hasn't gone away. It's still there.
Right. And going to a conversation that we had earlier before we started recording this episode, I want to kind of bring that in because, when we talk about those pillars, even those people out there that may have or may be understood by some as monsters, as hateful people, when we look at those people, we have to realize that they probably have very similar pillars that are holding their web up. Their web is very, very different. And it may be a very ugly web in the minds of most people.
Yes.
But those pillars, because they are human beings, are probably very similar. And if we go into a conversation with somebody like that and start with that understanding,
yes,
and treat them as a human being when we have that conversation, we can probably affect change in that web as they grow in human beings. I know this for a fact because I've had conversations with several people on the D-Rate the Hate podcast whose web has changed dramatically because they did start out with very similar pillars and a very ugly web.
But you didn't get them to change by attacking the inner nodes of their web, because they would have resisted that. You got them to think about the pillars underneath there and to realize that actually they have the same values that most of us do. And maybe something's not quite right here in the way that played out. But that had to come from them. That wasn't something you could just get in their face and say, your web is messed up, buddy.
Exactly. Yeah, because if you go in and just start to attack their web, I mean, we just keep on using it as a metaphor, and it's great. But yeah, you're right. If you just go in, because you're not going to knock down their pillars because the pillars are similar. But if their web is different, and you go in and you just start cutting strands because their web is ugly, you're not going to get any growth out of that.
No, you're going to make an even greater enemy.
You're either going to destroy them or they're going to destroy you. One way or another, it's going to be ugly. And so, yeah, this exercise has been something, like I said, it's something I've revisited a number of times, and it's just been one of those exercises that I've thought about over and over. And as our friendship, Francis, has developed, so much of what we've talked about, like I said, even though we have fairly significant differences on some things, we know that that our core values are the same. Many strands in our webs are very, very similar, you know, and our webs are certainly more similar than they are different.
Yeah.
And I think I just wish that more people understood how a project like this, or an exercise like this, you know, it just think about how much good can be done, Francis, in in our political system. I mean, break it all the way down to,
Oh, yeah.
you know, folks at their local school board meeting, you know, or conversations between a common working, you know, guy like myself and the local state senator of the opposing mindset, you
Mhm.
know, or two you know, two congressmen, or you know, think about if they would sit down and do this exercise prior to getting up there in front of a microphone. Because
Mhm.
right now they're just looking, you know, when they get up there in front of a microphone, a lot of times they're just looking to be as bombastic and get as many people riled up as they can.
Yeah, this does not bring out the best in people. It does the opposite.
Right. So if they would actually sit down and do an exercise like this web of beliefs, you know, and say, okay, you know, yeah, I look at, you know, I look at the mask thing as, you know, mandating masks was ineffective and inappropriate. Masking children did, you know, virtually no good. And then yours is different, you know, your leg there, and the depth at which yours is is different. But our
Mhm.
webs still look very similar, and we can have that conversation because we know there's more common, or we have more in common than we do not in common.
And you can
You
see
know,
that. Yep.
you can see that. So if they use that as a starting point, if they use that as a springboard in their conversation, how much better, how much more would get done by our public servants and the people that are supposed to be
Mm.
representing us than we see happening today, right?
Yeah, yeah. The challenge is, are people actually wanting to see this get better? That's part of the issue, I guess. Or are too many of us somehow kind of cherishing our anger, cherishing our resentment, hanging on to the fear because it's sort of drawing us into fellowship with other people who share the same fears? Do we have enough motivation now to try to fix this? You must think a lot about that, Wilk, and all the people you talk to must have some insights about that. Sometimes it does seem to me, and this is when I get discouraged, that people really don't want to knock down the barriers. They really don't want to stop hating those other people because it's an alternative to feeling angry and fearful and dissatisfied. To have a join with another group and have a common enemy gives you a sense of belonging. Belonging is powerful, and people don't want to give that up. So, how do we
Yeah,
change?
that yeah, and that is the $1 million question right there, is how do we change that mindset? Because like I've talked like I've talked to so many people on the podcast, I could have taken my podcast in a completely different direction, like so many people on social media do, and gone with the hate. I mean, originally my podcast was going to be just a haters happy hour where I would highlight people that would say hateful things to me online, and call them out for their hatefulness, and I knew that that wasn't going to make the world any better. You
No.
know, there is enough people out there spreading hate. So I decided I wanted to go a different direction, even though I knew it wasn't going to have the you know, the dramatic viral effect as these hateful, mean, you know, tweets or posts or memes or whatever
Mhm.
that you see out there. it wasn't going to have that same kind of effect. It's just the same thing. You know, I kind of think about politics the same way I think about, you know, professional wrestling. I loved watching WWF when I was a kid, and it's WWE now, you know, but they have these storylines where you've got the evil team on this side and the good
Yes.
guy on this side, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they absolutely hate each other, and they're screaming at each other, and they're yelling at each other in the ring, right? Well, the reason that that platform was so popular, and the reason that the McMahon family made so much money with WWF and then WWE is because of that conflict, that ugliness that was there. But those wrestlers that were beating the hell out of each other in the ring, you know, which was all, let's just say it was all for show. As soon as they would come, and they could be beating each other all the way up back to the dressing room. As soon as they walk through the dressing room, they're shaking hands, you know, patting each other on the back. Hey, that was a good thing, right? Good show, good show. We did a good job.
It was all a performance.
It was all a performance. And I think politics in a lot of ways used to be that way. It used to be that way. I don't think it is anymore. I think a lot of that stuff used to be political theater, you know, when you'd have your you know, your Harry Reeds, or even most recently, you know, Chuck and Nancy and them getting up and saying these hateful and mean things and whatever, and then, you know, and then they'd be going out to dinner with you know, Boehner after the fact. Okay, I don't think that's the way it is anymore. I think there's a lot of genuine hate and just downright seething hatred in our politics today. And it's gone beyond that political theater. It's gone beyond the good guys and the bad guys in the square circle, as they used to call it, you know.
No, you're right. Well, this is a town I live in, and that's a community of members of Congress that I've spent a lot of time with in the last 13 years. And it didn't used to be this way. Like you say, people would kind of do a little theater, especially if they weren't trying to make a point, wanted to get some attention. But then, yeah, they would basically have dinner together. But as time went on, got more and more entrenched. Part of the issue is, I think an awful lot of members of Congress don't really interact with each other, except in one of those fierce arguments. There's no opportunity to get to know each other, to actually find out that your pillars are the same as mine. And so what used to be, I think, a good part of our democracy was people didn't agree with each other, and they put forward their case and they argued about it, has morphed into something that is much more malignant in terms of the way in which people really are turning arguments into reasons to say the other person isn't just wrong, they're evil, they're dangerous.
Right, they're not just evil, and that's one of the big things that we've seen in you know, as a result of the pandemic and the government's response to the pandemic and stuff like that. And you know, we talked briefly about a book that you had recently read, this Untrustworthy book, and how people, you know, they're not simply wrong, they're evil, and if we don't, and obviously that's at the core of our project, Francis, our Truth and Trust project with Braver Angels. You and I have said from the very beginning that if we do not find a way for people to trust our institutions again, we are in a much worse spot going into the next one. And you and I both know that there is going to be a next one.
Yeah,
you know,
you're so right. I mean, this loss of trust in institutions, and just generally a loss of trust in experts, because everybody now has decided, I'm my own expert. I did my own research. I Googled this topic, or I read something on Facebook, and gosh, you know, this book you mentioned, Untrustworthy, which I read yesterday by an author named Bonnie Christian, spelled with a K, really has a whole chapter about what's happened to our distrust of expertise and how dangerous is that. She makes the point that we haven't completely given up our trust in experts. We drive across a bridge with a fairly good confidence that it's not going to fall down while we're driving across it. We basically, get in our car and expect that it is probably most of the time going to perform well. We probably make a lot of assumptions about the food that we eat, that it's probably safe because experts have prepared it and examined it. And we don't think about the fact that that might be something that's poisoning us. So we're still there in some ways, but when something becomes really visible, and especially if the expert seems to be coming in a partisan way from the other group that you're not part of, then suddenly it's like, I don't know if I trust that person or that particular area of expertise. And no matter how much people do their own research, we're always going to have people who know more about a topic than the average person. And to denigrate that and to say that's not something we're going to utilize for our own good is really dangerous for our future. But that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, it's scary because I saw a thing the other day. We've had vaccines around and life-changing, life-saving vaccines around that school children have gotten for years and years, and measles, mumps, rubella, polio, things like that really changed the course of human history.
Yes.
And those are things that if we go backwards on those, can you imagine the carnage that will be caused? But I saw a scary, and I don't know the numbers offhand, but I saw a scary statistic the other day that said that because of the vaccine mandates and the things that have gone on as a result of COVID-19, that there are a lot of people that wouldn't have thought twice before about getting their children vaccinated for polio, measles, mumps, rubella, everything else, because it was just automatic. It was something that we did as a human race because we know. But there are a vast, and there's always going to be there always has been a small percentage of the American public or the human race that say, okay, well, that's not for me. I'm not doing that to my kids, and then there's the fringe groups out there that say, oh, this causes autism and blah, 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 whatever. Okay, that was a very small percentage of the people. But now what's scary, Francis, is I saw that number is now growing as a result of the mRNA vaccines and the vaccine mandates and the things that have happened as a result of COVID-19. And I think that is also, obviously I've been outspoken about a number of the things that have happened as a result of the government's response to the pandemic. That one I think scares me the most.
I'm right there with you, because we're going to start to see kids dying of measles. I mean, go to Africa and watch kids die from measles, hundreds of them every day. We haven't had that in the US. If you drop below a certain percentage of kids that are immune, then the outbreaks are going to start to happen. And this is not just, and people are, oh, it's just a childhood disease. No, it's not. Oh. Kids die from this. Kids who are otherwise healthy can basically lose their lives. And this is totally preventable by something we know a lot about if people really look at the evidence. But again, it gets into that web where maybe people now have nodes near the center of their web that says, I don't trust vaccines anymore because of the blurriness of what happened with COVID and all of the arguments about this, where the V word of vaccine has now taken on some degree of skeptic response, and to the detriment and potentially the threatening of lives of children. I'm with you. That is really scary. That is a dramatic example of this overall trend to distrust expertise.
Yeah, no, and I think, the more that we can do to try and turn that around. So that's why I said that our project together, our Truth and Trust project, and obviously we're just two people part of a bigger project trying to do something to turn this thing around, and there are going to be a certain number of people that we cannot reach, but anybody that we can reach in this and say, okay, yeah, there were some huge mistakes made in this response. It was a huge, there were some things that were done incorrectly, but we all have to have clear heads coming out of this, because if we do not, there are going to be much, much worse ramifications the next time. And I just hope that, I look at every mistake, whether it be mine personally, or mine in business, or things that I see others doing. I try to look at everything as an opportunity, to learn something.
That's the way it ought to be.
And I just hope, like I said, I hope more level heads prevail. I hope we're able to look at this and say, okay, there are things that happened. Some people will apologize, some people won't. Some people will admit to their errors, some won't. Some people will admit to their complete delusional mentality that guided them down the wrong path. On both sides of the topic.
Yeah.
But it's all an opportunity to learn, and I hope that people do, because again, if we don't, there's going to be much, much worse ramifications going into the next event.
Well, there was an interesting article, I can't remember where it was published, that was put out saying, all of the tensions and upsets and angers that people have felt about how pandemic was not managed right is really getting in our way in terms of how to put ourselves back together again. Maybe we should have what she called pandemic amnesty, basically to say, okay, whichever side you were on this, mistakes were made on both sides. There are reasons for that. Some of them were just carelessness. Some of them were probably really intentionally misleading. Some of them were just the science changed and you were doing the best you could and turned out you were wrong when more data came along. Why don't we just sort of say, okay, there was a lot of screw ups here. Nobody is without fault. Let's just forgive each other and now try to put the pieces back together. And I thought, well, there's a certain point to that. The author of this was immediately attacked, which is pretty discouraging, by people on both sides.
Sure.
People who were mad about the government's response said, hell no, we're not going to let them off the hook. And that was some members of Congress who said that too.
Yeah.
And the people who were mad about the conspiracies and the anti-science, anti-vax thing said, hell no, we're not going to let them off the hook. They killed people. So it only just further seemed to escalate the tensions, when the goal was to say, let nobody be throwing stones here. We're all living in a glass house. Looks like that we're not there yet.
Yeah, we're not there. And I would look at something like that and say that's a very noble goal. Yeah. That's something that would be fantastic if it could work in reality. But much like, I try to take a pragmatic stance on most everything, and I look at that, and just like I talked about our opportunity to learn from our mistakes, I just mentioned that a couple minutes ago, and I think when it comes to amnesty, as much as I believe in the nobility of it, when it comes to amnesty, I think that gives a lot of people an opportunity to not take the opportunity to learn. Yeah. If that makes any sense.
I totally hear you. I mean, it occurs to me the alternative might be what was done in South Africa after apartheid, where there have been so much terrible things done on both sides, the blacks to the whites to the blacks. And what happened there was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, an amazing human being, basically put together this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it wasn't amnesty in the sense of, okay, everybody's forgiven. It was, if you will come forward and you will confess what you did that was wrong and genuinely repent it and seek forgiveness, then you will be forgiven and you will not be subjected to the interminable sort of Nuremberg trial version that might go on for years and make everybody even more resentful. And it worked.
Mm-hmm.
but it had to be associated, not just with, okay, just wipe the slate clean, everything's fine. It was people had to take responsibility for what
Yeah.
they had done wrong to be part of this. Maybe that's the kind of thing that could work, but I don't know how many people are ready to take responsibility just yet.
Right, right. No, that's right. And I think that's a phenomenal example of how things could be done and worked through, and possibly get to a better spot coming out of this than we were going into it. And that's a very, I think that's a very synergistic mentality. um you know
Yeah.
is doing that, because that would give everybody a chance to look at it. It gives the skeptics something to look at, as far as, okay, this person, is fessing up. But then those skeptics at that point, I think the only way to get the skeptics unskeptical is to have something like that happen. Because the only, again, we talked about in that web of beliefs, if you go at these people, these conspiracy theorists, and the, the skeptics, I would call this the conspiracy theorists, the um let's just use the QAnon people as an example. you know their beliefs, they're strongly, those inner nodes of that web are their QAnon beliefs. I still don't even, I'm gonna be honest with you, as much as I deal with hate and talk about hate on the D-Rate the Hate podcast, I still don't even know what QAnon is. Don't want to know, have not even typed it into my computer. Don't care. I mean, I do care, but it's ugly. I just know that.
Yeah, it's
Um,
ugly.
I've had several people on the podcast that have talked about it. I don't know enough about it to make any sense of it. But what I do know about those people, because I've dealt with several people that have that strong of a belief in what they believe, right? So just going right back to our web of beliefs to take it full circle, that is those inner circles of their web. That's
Yeah.
where they believe strongest. So
Yeah.
if you just attack that, um, you're not going to win them over.
No.
The same way with the skeptics and the full on anti healthcare people now. You know, if you just attack that, you're not going to win. If you don't come at them with something more like, look, yes, we made some mistakes. These are the mistakes we made. We are eternally sorry. We need to work together to fix this.
Mhm.
We're not going to get to those inner circles of that web. They're just going to put up their defenses, and it's not going to happen. So I love the example of the Desmond Tutu apartheid, and how that was reconciled coming out of apartheid. And it's that, I think that's a fantastic example, and I think that's what's going to be needed. um
I'm sorry, Archbishop Tutu is not with us anymore. He would be a great person to make this speech.
right,
He's
right.
probably one of the people in my life that I've most admired, and had a chance to meet with him a couple of times. And you're just in the presence of somebody like that, and you feel goodness and joyfulness. And he was a wonderful a guy with a great sense of humor who had this ability to giggle about almost everything, even in a very serious situation. It was disarming, and it was absolutely lovable. And I wish he was still around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of those people that did so much good for the, I mean, for the whole human race. Let's just put it
Yeah,
that way. I mean,
yeah,
did incredible things for the world in which we live. And yeah, if there was more people like him, we'd have far less problems in the
yes.
in the world in which we live today. Well, Francis, I know we're getting about to the end of our time. We could carry on this conversation. I mean, like so many of our conversations, we could go
Yes, we could.
for so much longer. But for the sake of time, we do have to wrap things up. I mean, just another incredible conversation. I always enjoy our time together.
Me too.
And I hope that the listeners get as much out of these conversations as you and I do from having these conversations.
I hope so too. I always learn stuff, and Wilk, it's been wonderful getting to be your friend over the course of these months of going back and forth. We still disagree about things, and that's good. Otherwise, one of us would not be necessary.
That's right. That is
at the
absolutely
same time, the goodwill that has developed between us, this genuine friendship, it makes me feel hopeful about all kinds of other relationships that need to be fixed as well. And so I'm hoping people hearing this, if they're in a circumstance of also feeling estranged from people who used to be friends, don't give up. You've still got a lot in common if you can get past the complications of your different webs and back down to those values, those pillars. You'll find that we're all probably still pretty much in the same place. We really do care about those same values. Let's just try to recover that.
absolutely right. Couldn't say it better myself, my friend. I so much appreciate it, Dr. Francis Collins. Until our next conversation, thank you very much.
Thanks, Wilk. Keep it up, man.
Friends, if there's anything in this episode that provided exceptional value to you, please make sure to hit that share button. Share it with your friends, share it far and wide. And of course, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe right from our website so you can get the D-Rate the Hate podcast sent to your email inbox every week. So this is Wilk wrapping up for the week saying get out there, be kind to one another, be grateful for everything that you've got, and remember it's up to you to make each and every day the day that you want it to be. If there is something that you would like to share with me, you can catch me on most social media platforms, or you can email me directly, wilk@wilksworld.com. With that, my friends, I am going to back on out of here, and we will catch you next week. Take care.